All right, so our next speaker is Stephen O'Brien. He's taught at University College Dublin, the University of Liverpool, and the University of Chester. He does research on warfare and society in late Bronze Age Aegean, and he is going to be giving the paper, guess who's back? Graeber and Wengrow's Resurrection of Matristic Minoans in, quote, the dawn of everything. So, Stephen, please tell me you're there.
I'm here, yeah. If I just share my screen with you.
Please do.
All right. Hopefully people can see this.
Yes.
Is that all okay?
Yes, very good.
Great. Okay, so I'd like to start, obviously, by thanking the conference organizers for allowing me to speak at this event, and also to the other people who've given papers that have been extremely interesting. And as we've been seeing, as with...
Oops, you muted yourself.
Sorry, as we've been seeing, lots of aspects of Minoan archaeology begin with Arthur Evans. And this is also true of the concept of a Minoan matriarchy. His interpretations of the archaeology of Knossos, plausibly at least, influenced by the sort of matriarchal thinking of James Frazer, perhaps transmitted to him by the classicist Jane Harrison. Now, such matriarchal thinking broadly passed out of favour, at least amongst academic researchers. But there was something of a revival once again from the 1970s, with the work of Maria Gimbutas proving highly influential. And certainly a pop culture view of prehistoric Crete as matriarchal has remained strong. Coming forward nearly a century in time from the publication of the Golden Bough in 2021, we got the publication of David Graeber and David Wengrow's best-selling book, The Dawn of Everything, in which they, a professional archaeologist and a professional anthropologist, really take a sort of global look at history of humanity, and one that reaches right the way back to the start of modern humans. But they find time in this book to devote at least a few pages to a reassessment of Minoan archaeology, and it's one that puts forward a matristic case. Now, they seek to distance themselves from any early 20th century theories about matriarchy, and they state that to them, when they say matriarchy, what they're talking about is just a situation in which women hold the preponderance of day-to-day power. And while the book itself only contains one direct reference to Frazer, it clearly operates in a tradition of thought which stretches back to him. And we might see this if I start by actually outlining Graeber and Wengrow's reconstruction of Minoan Crete. And certainly they find no evidence of a monarchy on the island. They claim that most frequent depictions of authority figures in Minoan art are women. And they claim that from the proto-palatial period onwards, foreign trade goods in Crete tend to have a distinctly female character. Like other people, they noticed that the Cretan palaces were unfortified and that there are only a few references to any kind of warfare in Minoan art. And they're particularly struck by the throne room at Knossos, which of course has a lustral basin facing opposite the throne. And they very much see that lustral basin as being associated with a female initiation ceremony linked to menstruation, on the basis that on the island of Thera at Akrotiri, there's the preserved Bronze Age site where a lustral basin is associated with various frescoes, apparently connected to a female initiation rite, and the menstruation idea comes from this fresco image of a woman with a bleeding foot. So they believe that the throne room at Knossos is the seat of a female council head, with female councillors arranged either side of her on the two stone benches that are present in that room. And they believe that the political system, certainly at Knossos and presumably on the island more generally, is a theocracy governed by a college of priestesses. And in common with a lot of other theories, all of this ends around 1500 BC with a Mycenaean takeover of the island from the mainland, although such a takeover is, of course, a matter of ongoing archaeological debate. And we can look at this reconstruction and sort of poke around at it a bit and see if everything here adds up. Certainly, I think you don't have to look all that far in Minoan art to find some male authority figures. One of the more famous examples is this image, the master impression, a ceiling from Cania, depicting this masculine figure standing on top of a sort of stylized representation of a city. And there are others in Minoan art. It's also true that gender ambiguity is not really considered in Graeber and Wengrow's book, although the idea of such ambiguity in Minoan art has been something of a research interest in the Aegean over the last couple of decades. In terms of warfare, there are in fact numerous hilltop or fortified Minoan sites. These were first catalogued by Stylianos Alexiou in 1979, and that's been expanded on by the work of a number of other archaeologists since. When we come to the throne room at Knossos and its lustral basin, then we do have to wonder to what extent that throne room might be a Mycenaean creation. There is certainly a sort of more Mycenaeanized culture on the island after about 1500 BC. And it's actually possible that the lustral basin was constructed at that time. In any case, it's not entirely clear whether the lustral basin on the island of Thera is necessarily a good guide to the purpose of the one in the throne room at Knossos. The Thera example is, of course, not even on the island of Crete, and it is a site not normally considered a Minoan one, but from a Cycladic culture that may have had notable differences. And various studies of lustral basins at Minoan sites have suggested that they might actually have had a number of different functions rather than one singular kind of use. Now, all of this doesn't necessarily change Graeber and Wengrow's overall point about a female council of rulers, but I think it does help demonstrate some of the complexity of the evidence that's being used here. We also come to the use in The Dawn of Everything of Jack Dempsey's essay, The Shapes of Minoan Desire, about Minoan art, in which the author talks about Minoan art being based on nature engaged in a perpetual dance, with no sign of, quote, the self-perpetuating, power-hungry ego, or what Graeber and Wengrow go on to describe as very much being our concept of politics. So it seems that Crete has a very different system of power and politics and society by dint of being matristic. But of course, we can find other different impressions of Minoan art and architecture. Here, for example, the novelist Evelyn Waugh visited Knossos in the 1920s and came to a rather different conclusion. Specifically on the subject of the throne room, as he says, he describes it as this squat little throne set on a landing where the paths of the palace intersect. It is not the seat of a lawgiver, nor a divan for the recreation of a soldier. Here, an aging despot might crouch and have borne to him along the walls of a whispering gallery, barely audible intimations of his own murder. So quite a different outlook on Minoans to the one that you would get from Jack Dempsey. And I'm not suggesting that Waugh is necessarily more correct than Dempsey in this thing. It's entirely possible that neither of them are correct. But these are the problems with trying to somehow distill the essential nature of a society by looking and getting our impressions of its art and its architecture. But without wanting to seem too negative, Graeber and Wengrow quite possibly are correct in detecting some interesting evidence about women and their roles in society on Minoan Crete. There are other archaeologists recently who have pointed to some things. Jan Dreysen's 2012 paper, for example, has argued for a Minoan society which was matrilineal and matrilocal, which he suggests may in fact have given a higher status to women in Minoan society than some of the neighbouring cultures, but without it necessarily being a matriarchy. And only a couple of years after that, Barbara Olsen's book analysing women through the Linear B texts, she determined that even in the Mycenaean period at Knossos, there were non-priestly women who owned land and controlled commodities. And it's quite possible that that represents a holdover from the pre-Mycenaean system, from the Minoan society, in which women did in fact have positions of power and authority. So in that sense, and in the spirit of Graeber and Wengrow's call for more radical thinking and for greater freedom, let us suppose for the purposes of the argument that their construction, their reconstruction of a Matristic Bronze Age Crete ruled by a theocratic council of women is correct. What else can we tell about the nature of that society? Graeber and Wengrow question whether Minoan Crete was even a regime of domination at all, arguing that instead of power being based on violent sovereignty, power in the Minoan system was based on administration and ritual power instead. But as we've seen, there were in fact a number of defended sites in Minoan Crete. And it's possible to point to what we might think of as other early states with a lack of fortified centres, perhaps Shang China, perhaps the Indus Valley in the Bronze Age. And maybe most tellingly, Crete, of course, does see the development of some of the earliest true bronze swords in the world. There's one in this picture. And unlike spears or bows, swords are only actually useful if you want to kill other people. They're not any good for trying to hunt animals with. So we might argue what this matristic, peaceful Crete, what need it has to develop weapons like this. It's true, again, that Minoan art contains few references to war. But while Minoan art may be different to that found elsewhere in the Eastern Mediterranean, this does not necessarily mean that the society that created that art was so entirely different. And we can look further at, of course, historical and ethnographic examples of societies where women were not excluded from power in the way that some of our stereotypes about the past would have it. Fairly famously, there's the kingdom of Dahomey in West Africa between the 17th and 19th centuries AD, famous anthropologically for its possession of entirely female military units in the army of the kingdom. But what's perhaps less well known is that it also boasted a political and cultural structure in which female officials at the palace could actually wield considerable power. But the presence of these powerful female officials, and in fact soldiers, did not prevent Dahomey from being a militaristic state which engaged in raids for slaves who were then employed either locally or sold into the European-created Atlantic slave trade. And I would like to spend a little bit of time as well thinking about one last part of Graeber and Wengrow's equation, which is, of course, their contrast, which you will find in a number of other sources of various types as well, between Minoan and Mycenaean culture. Absolutely central to the concept of the book, The Dawn of Everything, is this idea of schismogenesis, the idea that neighboring societies differ from each other, often on deliberately chosen moral and ethical grounds, rather than due to the influence of material factors or just a hard to explain cultural difference. And in this view, for Graeber and Wengrow, the Mycenaeans on the mainland are very much a heroic society, male-dominated and warrior-based. And they grow up on the outskirts of an urbanized society with women in positions of authority, and as we've seen, apparently based on administration and ritual rather than violence. And this sort of schismogenesis on this model is a general pattern which Graeber and Wengrow first detect in the Chalcolithic period of southwestern Asia. But I feel we have to ask whether the reality might be slightly more complicated than that once again. The shaft grave burials at Mycenae on the Greek mainland contain a number of female sexed skeletons associated with burial goods, including swords or seals with combat imagery, as in this slide here, i.e. the same kind of material that is found buried with male skeletons in those same graves. Now, this material does not necessarily have to be read biographically, as in outlining the existence of female warriors, any more than that material necessarily means that the man buried with it is also a warrior. But it might well be that we're looking at a Mycenaean society where the language of power, the material language of power, did not in fact fully exclude women. And if that's true, then Minoan and Mycenaean societies don't represent schismogenic opposites of one another, but rather they represent two societies which both defy various stereotypes of women in the past. So to wrap up, Graeber and Wengrow largely look to revive a version of a Matristic Crete, which ultimately has its origins back in the work of Gimbutas and Evans and Frazer. Now, I feel that a lot of the evidence either runs counter to their claims or at least should temper the level that those claims are being made to. But as we've also seen, there is actually evidence for women having status and power of various kinds in Minoan Crete. And as we discover more about women in positions of power and authority in prehistory, we perhaps also need to consider the evidence for things like violent sovereignty and domination in those societies. Freed from Victorian-era binaries, women's roles in the past become more rather than less interesting. And so at least on this subject, a century on from the Golden Bough, there's no need to try and resurrect a dying goddess in the form of Frazer's thought. Thank you.